Several weeks ago when Randy told me that he was going to be looking after Diane and that he'd like me to take this class, I started thinking about what I wanted to teach, and I picked out Mark 8:31 through 38. And then, just coincidentally, as these things so often do happen, Randy used those same scriptures on Sunday morning, and I thought, I'm going to keep going with what I got. We'll just reinforce it once we get there. They won't be the exact same verses, but most of them are. And Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise from the dead. And he was stating the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's purposes, but on man's." And he summoned the crowd together with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it benefit a person to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?" In the Bay of Bengal, I think I've told you the story about an island. It's called North Sentinel Island. It is the home to one of the world's last remaining isolated tribes. It is on the westernmost side. You can see that little dot right there, that little red dot right there. It's to the western side of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands that are off the coast of Thailand. Called the Sentinelese tribe, these people live in complete isolation, and they are protected by Indian law to maintain their way of life and protect them from modern illnesses because they lack immunity. Just over a dozen people are officially thought to live on that remote island. They represent some of the last people on earth whose way of life remains entirely undisturbed by modern civilization. Several months ago, Ange and I started looking for a show to watch at night that we could both agree on, and so after a couple of years of working through that, we settled on Survivor, and we started watching Survivor with each passing season. Survivor, the first season came out when I was in college. It came out, I believe, in 2000 or 2001, and I remember watching that very first season. But after watching that season, probably because I was in college, I stopped watching it and had never really seen any other episodes until recently when I realized, and I had no idea Survivor was still going on, that Survivor, I believe, is in its 50th season. I had no idea that it was in its 50th season. And so she and I started watching these season by season by season. And in the early years, they would go to different locations. They would go to Borneo, or they would go to Panama, or they would go to Curacao. They would go to different kinds of places. And in some of the rewards that these contestants would earn from challenges, they would go to a remote tribe in a local village, and they would have some kind of Peruvian feast, or they would interact with those tribes in ways that you and I will really never have an opportunity to interact. This island is like that, except it's the most remote of the remote. People are not allowed to go within 5 nautical miles of it after previous incidents of aggressive behavior toward outsiders were observed, because the island has a history of violence toward anybody who would approach it. In 2006, 2 men were killed who were illegally fishing on their reef. In 2004, in the wake of a tsunami in the Indian Ocean, a photo was taken of one of the men on the island who was attempting to shoot arrows at the helicopter that had come to check on their well-being. You can see from a distance the Sentinelese tribe here off the southernmost coast of their island. And I tell you this story because in 2018, that young man you see there, a 26-year-old missionary named John Allen Chow, was killed by the Sentinelese tribe after being taken under the cover of darkness by fishing boats so that he might try to bring the gospel to the people of the Sentinelese. In pages left with the fisherman who facilitated his trip to the island, his musings are a clear indication of his desire to convert the tribe. He says, quote, "Lord, is this Satan's last stronghold where none have heard or even had the chance to hear your name?" His notes indicate that he knew the trip was illegal, describing how the small fishing vessel transported him to the isolated island under cover of darkness, evading patrols. He writes, "God himself was hiding us from the Coast Guard and many patrols, but all 7 locals who helped facilitate that trip were arrested once it had come to pass that they had brought him to the island." In full transparency, I vacillate between thinking, what an ambition, and what an idiot. And I say that with great hesitation, almost feeling blasphemous for even thinking along those lines, but I'm human like the rest of you, and I'm guessing some of you have similar thoughts. In fact, when Chow's death became international news, many Christians were keen to disavow his actions. His father believed that the American missionary community was culpable in his son's death. Simultaneously, the company that he worked with, which was called All Nations, described him as a martyr. And in a story that was written about him following his death, the author says Chow's decision to contact the Sentinelese, who have made it clear over the years that they prefer to be left alone, was indefensibly reckless. But it was not a spontaneous act of recklessness by a dim-witted thrill seeker. It was a premeditated act of recklessness by a fairly intelligent and thoughtful thrill seeker who spent years preparing, understood the risks, including to his own life, and believed his purpose on earth was to bring Christ to the island he considered, quote, Satan's last stronghold. Now, we could certainly spend time debating Chow's method, but I think it would be difficult to challenge his motive. He was quoted as saying, "It's worth it to take Jesus to the people." Well, what is worth what? He was saying. What was worth what? The opportunity that they would know God, he was saying, was worth the risk of death. That my life, he was saying, is worth the risk of telling the Sentinelese people the gospel. His one life. My students and I, in the last several Wednesdays, have been talking about the idea that we only get one life. And how are we spending it? I talked with them about video games I would play as a boy where I would get unlimited lives, or we talked about other things in life that maybe you don't just get one shot at, but in life you just get one. And are we living with the end in mind? Are we living with heavenly mindedness? One of my favorite preachers writes a book in which he talks about his father, who was an evangelist, preaching at a church when an old man walked to the front, spent some time talking with him, and decided to be baptized and give his life to Christ. And as he sat there, he wept and kept saying again and again and again, "I've wasted it, I've wasted it." And he was referring to the 70-plus years on earth that he had lived, wasting what he believed was a life that had been intended to be lived for God. See, we only get one, right? He talks more in that book about a painting that hung in his house from the time that he was a little boy until he graduated at home and left home at 18. And it was a painting that had 2 roads and a cottage, some trees, and a phrase that said, "Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last." And I'm guessing that there might be 1 or 2 people in this auditorium who have a similar picture hanging in their homes or have seen one similar to that. How do we go about life without wasting so much of it? How do we live life well? Or maybe we would ask somewhat the opposite. If we live life well, are we pursuing a successful career? Are we trying to be maximally happy, or to accomplish something great, or to find the deepest meaning of significance, or to help as many people as possible? What is the main thing that defines a life lived well? Well, according to that quote that young boy looked at for his whole life, it was a life characterized by things that were done for Christ. That's what dictated a life that was lived well. And if that's true, and I'm only saying if for the moment, but if that's true, then what can we point to in our lives that we can say, that's going to last? What are the things that we have done in life that we can say, on the other side, that's going to have mattered, right? We give our lives with such frequency, so much thought and so much passion and time to things that will not translate to the other side. How do we live life with the end in mind so that the things that we passionately give ourselves to are the things that truly matter? We have a lot of talented people in this room, people who play instruments well and write well and have original thoughts and intelligent ideas, and people who might one day be Division I athletes. We have people who are extremely artistic. And yet, many of those things, while great, and I hope you pursue them with excellence, are not things that are going to last in spiritual terms to the other side. And so when we read in Mark chapter 8, Jesus talking about taking up our cross, Jesus is saying, don't waste your life. For what good is it to get home and money and a marriage and a career and kids and all the things that your heart desire if you don't pursue the thing that you were made for? What a tragedy. And if there is only one life to live in the world, and if it's not to be wasted, don't you think that you would do everything you could to find what was most important and find what was most valuable? Matthew 13 says he summoned the crowd together with his disciples and said, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to lose his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it, and for the gospel will save it as well. What does it benefit a person to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? That's not Matthew 13, that's Mark chapter 8. Matthew 13 compares the gospel to a treasure hidden in a field. And when it's found, the person who finds it goes and sells everything that he has so that he can come back and buy that field because he knows the value that he has found. But is that how people treat the gospel? Largely no. Because few people take the time to truly study the Word of God and try and understand it in a way that completely changes their lives. So many people hear about the power of Christianity, they hear about the good of Christianity, but they don't ever fully give themselves to it. And at some point in life, what they've heard and what they've been told doesn't mix up with what they've experienced. And the cognitive dissonance between the gospel's supposed to do this, but this is what it's doing in my life, is so great that it leaves them disillusioned, not fully understanding what it is because they've never fully given themselves to it. That is the majority of those who would call themselves Christian today. This is the whole of misunderstanding and the lie behind the statistics that there are millions and millions and millions of Christian people all over the world. Many of you know Jonathan Edwards, or know of Jonathan Edwards, who was famous for writing the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But he's also known for his resolutions. We looked at these a few weeks ago in our class, but between 1772 and 1773, at 19 years of age, Jonathan Edwards wrote 70 resolutions. Among them were these: resolved that I will do whatsoever I think to be most to God's glory, and my own good, profit, and pleasure, in the whole of my duration, without any consideration of the time, whether now or never, so many myriads of ages hence. Resolved to do whatever I think to be my duty and most for the good and advantage of mankind in general. Number 2, resolved never to lose one moment of time, but improve it with the most profitable way I possibly can. Resolved never to do anything which I should be afraid to do if it were the last hour of my life. Resolved never to suffer the least motions of anger to irrational beings. And there are a few others up here. You can read them if you would like. But he sat down at 19 years of age and, looking at his life with heaven in mind, said, I'm going to resolve to do these 70 things. And so in my class a month ago, we sat down and I gave our students cards. And I told them that we didn't have time to write 70 resolutions, but we had time to write 2 or 3. And we talked about Jonathan Edwards, the words of a man who looked at his life and realized, I only have one to live. And he said, I'm going to live it to the fullest. I'm not going to waste a moment. And so, our students wrote their resolutions. And I told them at the time that I was probably going to read some of them to you. I won't read their names. But here's what some of them wrote. Resolved to watch my temper and not let my stress carry over into how I treat others. Resolved that I will trust God through my social anxiety. Resolved, I vow to reserve my judgment of others as the Lord shall be the one to judge us. Resolved to abandon perfidious speech and gossip that is harmful. Resolved to never speak or think evil behind anyone's back. Resolved to think about how my attitude affects the people who are around me. Resolved, I will live my life to the fullest and try not to miss opportunities out of fear. Resolved, I will keep a good and calm temper in all escalated situations. And why did we do this? Why think about this at all? Because we want to live a life that is well lived, a life worthy of the call of the gospel. In other words, are the things that I am living for worth Jesus having died for? Are the things that I am living my life for things that are worth Jesus having died for? Humanity today has found an untold number of ways to waste time. From devices to social media to video games to YouTube to Netflix. Someone once said that America is the first culture in danger of amusing itself to death. The first culture that is in danger of amusing itself to death. Is there something to be gained from those mediums? Perhaps a small amount, but not nearly as much as is being consumed. The big questions, what is life about? Why do I exist? Am I here to be happy? Am I here to glorify God? Many people think that those things are at odds. But the Bible is very clear about why we are here. And I've talked about this at length in numerous classes, both in my classroom in the back and in the auditorium. In Isaiah 43, we read, I will say to the north, give them up, and to the south, do not hold them back. Bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth. Everyone who is called by my name and whom I have created. Why? For my glory, says the Lord. I created you for my glory, whom I have formed, even whom I have made. I tell my students all the time, we all have the same purpose. People walking around like, what's my purpose? We have the same purpose. Our purpose is to bring glory to the name of the Lord. And how you go about doing that is going to be different, but the purpose is still the same. And that's not sexy, right? Like, that's not culturally appropriate, that I'm going to spend my life trying to make great the name of the Lord. Most people want to spend their lives trying to make great their own name, but that is not the reason that we were called. The Bible makes it very clear that you and I are here for His glory. God created us for His glory. And so we address difficult questions. I had a question, I think it was John Michael that asked me, doesn't that make God selfish? And it seems as though it would. Doesn't it seem as though God creating us for His glory, creating us to make His name great, doesn't it seem like that's selfish? And yet, what greater thing could possibly be done in life? When I seek to glorify my own name, who benefits from that? Me. You don't benefit from that. You don't benefit from me trying to make more of the name of Sean McAfee. But if I make more of the name of the Lord, you do benefit from that. And so when we collectively bring glory to the name of God, we are collectively blessed, not just here, but across the globe, because blessing the name of the Lord benefits all people, not just an individual. We waste our lives when we don't live for the glory of the Lord. All of life. That's why the Bible even gets down to the simple stuff of eating and drinking. Therefore, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink or whatever it is that you're doing, do all things for whose glory? Not my glory, not your glory. Do all things for the glory of God. Well, okay, what does that mean? What does it mean to what does glorify mean? It means simply that we magnify God in a way that brings attention and awe and praise to who He is and not me. John 3:30, He must become greater, I must become what? Less. And so we waste our lives when we do not pray and think and dream and plan and work toward magnifying God in as many areas as we possibly can. That is why God created us, but it's not something that most people are going to find worthwhile. Henry Morrison was a missionary in Africa for 40 years. He and his wife converted scores of African people to the faith. Each day had brought joy and sorrow and pain and wonder. But because of poor health, the mission board that they were associated with decided to bring Henry and his wife back to the United States for retirement as teachers and encouragers for other missionaries. The ship on which they sailed from the African continent to New York City docked with a huge crowd on shore. There were bands playing, and there were balloons floating in colorful array, and flags fluttering in the breeze. And the people cheered, and they waved their banners that read, "Welcome home." And Henry and his wife leaned on the rail and were blown away at the fact that their life had not been forgotten. And then President Teddy Roosevelt and his companions stepped off the gangplank to the roar of the onlookers because Henry was not aware that Teddy Roosevelt had spent 3 weeks in Africa on a hunting safari with a large group of companions. The fanfare, of course, was not for them. It was for the big game hunter. And when he sped off in the presidential car, the crowd dispersed along with all the reporters. Henry Morrison took his wife's hand, and together they made their way down the now quiet gangplank to the empty docks. Not one person greeted them. They eventually hailed a cab to go to the one-bedroom apartment that was supplied by the mission board. And Henry Morrison fell into a deep depression. All of those years, all of those souls, all of that work. And he told his wife how distraught he was that they had spent so many years doing what the Lord had asked them to do, and hardly a soul in the States knew anything about it. And so she told him that he probably ought to take that to the Lord. And so he went into his room and he began to pray. "This is wrong, God. The president comes back from a hunting party and everyone throws a party. We've spent 40 years in missionary service and no one seems to care." And then he says, in the quietness of that moment, he heard a small voice speak and said, "Yes, but my son, you're not home yet. You're not home yet." Doing something of eternal significance may be done in great obscurity here, but it is of great notoriety in heaven. And I'd like to think that Henry Morrison, when he died, that there was a greeting for him that far surpassed the greeting that he experienced on the docks of that New York City harbor when he returned from Africa 40 years after he began his work. Because so much of what God values, our culture simply does not, and vice versa. I think there are many servants who are going to do many things in great obscurity here, but they'll be very noteworthy in heaven. Who would you rather hear "well done" by? Someone here or someone there? A reward, right, that will never perish or spoil or fade. A few years ago, Jack Johnson went into the hospital. You'll remember that, when he went into the hospital and spent several days there. And I had lunch with Jack yesterday, it was. But several months ago, I just came up to him and I said, "Jack, something's different. Like something's changed. I've known you for 20 years. Something's changed." And he talked about how things have changed for him, and among the things that changed him were that time when he was there in the hospital. Last week, Tim Specht wound up in the hospital over something that appeared to be more serious than perhaps many of us know, and fortunately came through it well. But he told me on Sunday, he said, "That changed me. more than a decade ago, I spent a few weeks as well in the hospital. And for those of you who have, especially with anything remotely serious, you know that when you're faced with your mortality, things get real pretty quick. Life becomes much clearer pretty quick. And all the things that burden me and all the things that bog down my mind and give me anxiety and all the things that weigh on me suddenly don't seem nearly as important as they once were in light of whether or not I'm living with the end in mind. Nothing that's truly done for Jesus will be wasted. Nothing. Everything that's done for him will last. And so I want to live my life, not, what does Paul say? Forgetting what is behind and pressing toward what is ahead. I want to do things that make a difference. I want to store up my treasures in heaven, not on earth. And so, he never promised that it would be worthy, but he promised it would be worth it. Hebrews 10, we read, "But recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward." 1 Corinthians 15, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." And finally, in Colossians 3, "If you then have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth." The impetus of all of this is heaven. The promise of heaven should change the way that we live our lives on earth. Am I living with the end in mind? C.S. Lewis once said, "If you read history, you will find that the Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought the most of the next. The apostles themselves who set on foot the conversion of the Roman Empire, the great men who built up the Middle Ages, the English evangelicals who abolished the slave trade, all left their mark on earth precisely because their minds were occupied with heaven. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this. Aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither." In April of 2000, Ruby Eliazon and Laura Edwards were killed in Cameroon, West Africa. Ruby was over 80. Single all of her life, she poured it out for one great thing: to make Jesus known among the unreached, the poor, and the sick in Cameroon. Laura was a widow. She was a medical doctor, almost 80 years old, and she was serving at Ruby's side in Cameroon. They were in a car with 6 people near some cliffs when the brakes went out, and as the car rolled backward, it hit a tree, throwing everyone out of the car. The other 4 people lived. Ruby and Laura fell to the rocks below and were killed instantly. Was this a tragedy? 2 lives driven by passion to serve the poor for the glory of Jesus Christ in West Africa. 2 decades after most of their American peers had retired to throw away their lives. That's not a tragedy. That's what we call a glory. Those lives were not wasted. Contrast that with this. In February of 1998, in an edition of Reader's Digest, you don't even probably know what that is, there was an article about a couple who took an early retirement from their jobs in the Northeast when he was 59 and she was 51. Now they live in Punta Gorda, Florida, where they cruise on their 30-foot trawler, play softball, and collect shells. This is the American dream. Come to the end of your life, your one and only life, and let the great final work of your life, before you give an account to God, be collecting shells. Imagine them before Christ at the great day of judgment. Look, Lord, see my shells. That's a tragedy. That is a tragedy. That is madness. And you could write the same story about untold millions of people across our world today. You don't have to know a lot of things for your life to make a lasting difference in the world. But you do have to know a few great things that matter, perhaps even just one, and be willing to both live and die for that thing. The people that make a big difference in the world are typically not people who have mastered many things, but somebody who has mastered one great thing. As I age, and though I'm not old, I am aging. As I age and I watch my children grow, I'm constantly reflecting on whether the things that we are engaging them in are things that are worth Christ dying for. Man, it happens fast. Some of you have had it come and go. Man, it happens fast. And I want to leave the trivial behind and move forward in heavenly mindedness, believing that the things that are done for Christ will truly last to the other side. 2 minutes. I told them this story the other day. When I was a boy, my dad made me sit down and read a book by James Dobson called Preparing for Adolescence. Oh my gosh, talk about the worst possible book to make a 12-year-old boy read. He also made me listen to a cassette tape by James Dobson. And so I would drive in my car and I would pop that cassette tape in and I would listen to him, and he told a story that and I'll tell you what, I don't remember a single thing maybe about that book today. I don't remember a single thing about that cassette tape except for one story, which I've probably told you before, but I don't care. I'm going to tell you again because I love it. James Dobson, some years ago, was playing basketball in a gymnasium in Colorado on the campus of Focus on the Family with a former athlete known as Pete Maravich. Pistol Pete Maravich he may still be the leading scorer in college basketball history. And they were playing basketball together, shooting around in the gym, when Maravich made a remark about being in really good shape. But Maravich was also a bit of a jokester. And so after making a shot, he went down to one knee and acted as though he were feeling poorly, and Dobson laughed and turned around to go get the basketball. But when he turned around again, he saw that Pistol Pete Maravich was laying there lifeless on that cold gym floor, and so he rushed over to him and did what he could, but it was too late. And Pete Maravich died on that gym floor in the arms of James Dobson. And Dobson went home that day and found his son. And he said, I want you to know that this is not some freak occurrence. Things like this happen every single day. People die every day. Some of them die when they're older, and some of them die when they're younger, and some of them you've got a lot of notice, and some of them you have no notice. And he said, there may come a time when I'm about to go and you can't get to be by my side. This story kills me every time I tell it. He said, you can't be there by my side. And he said, if that happens, I want to give you my final words right now. If there ever comes a time when I'm about to pass and you can't make it to my side, my last words to you are these. Be there. Be there. Because I'm going to be there waiting on you. I'm going to be there waiting on you. You've got to make sure you're there. That for all the things you pursue in life, for all the good things you do and experience, the people that you teach and you interact with, whatever glories you are after, make sure you be there on the other side. Am I living with the end in mind?